July 4th, San Angelo, Texas. And like a lot of places across the country that night, people are heading out to watch fireworks. Families, teenagers, couples. And among them are two young people named Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart. Sally's 18 and Shane is 16. They've dated before, broken up, and now they've found their way back to each other. At least for tonight. Their plan? Well, it's pretty ordinary. They're going to Lake Nasworthy, where San Angelo holds its annual 4th of July fireworks display. And Shane has something that he's especially proud of. His car, a copper-colored 1980 Camaro. According to later reporting, Shane leaves home that day with $11 in his pocket. He gives his dad a big hug, walks out the door, and goes to spend the evening with Sally. And if we stopped right here, this story, well, there wouldn't be anything particular unusual about it, would there? We've got two teenagers. It's the 4th of July, a hot summer night, a Camaro, and fireworks over a Texas lake. But sometime during the next several hours, something happens. And we still don't know exactly what. Because by the following morning, Sally and Shane are gone. But Shane's Camaro, it isn't. It's found abandoned. And here's one of the first strange things about this case that made me stop. The car, it's not at Lake Nasworthy. It's sitting near another body of water, O.C. Fisher Reservoir, roughly about 8 miles away. So now the questions, well, they start to form. If Sally and Shane went to Lake Nasworthy, why is Shane's car at the O.C. Fisher Reservoir? And more importantly, where exactly are Sally and Shane? Nobody knows. A search begins, days pass, then weeks. Summer ends, and still no Sally, no Shane. Then November arrives, 4 months after the young couple disappeared. Hunters make a discovery, but not at Lake Nasworthy and not at the O.C. Fisher Reservoir. They find human remains near a third body of water, Twin Buttes Reservoir. And eventually, investigators will determine that the remains do in fact belong to Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart. Both have been shot, both murdered, and suddenly we now have 3 locations. First, we have Lake Nasworthy, where Sally and Shane went to watch the fireworks. Then we've got the O.C. Fisher Reservoir, where Shane's Camaro was found. And finally, we've got the Twin Buttes Reservoir, where Sally and Shane were eventually recovered. 3 places, and somewhere between them is a story investigators have been trying to reconstruct for nearly 40 years. And here's the thing. You, like myself, well, we remember hearing about Sally and Shane's case from a very popular television show back in the late 80s and early 90s, Unsolved Mysteries. And we remember a very different part of the story. We remember hearing about Satanism, an alleged cult, and occult rituals, and a gun that Sally and Shane reportedly turned over to law enforcement months before they died. But that was more than 30 years ago, and a lot has happened with this investigation since then. So while I was researching this case, I started wondering something. Was the occult connection actually the clue everyone thought it was? Or did it cause people to spend years looking in the wrong direction? I don't know. But I think we can figure out what the evidence actually tells us. And to do that, we need to go back before the murders, before the alleged cult, before the gun that was turned over, back to when Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart were simply Sally and Shane. And before we get into everything that eventually surrounded this case, I want you to know something about Sally. Because if you search her name today, it doesn't take long before you start seeing words like murder, occult, Satanism, cult. And that's what happens in cases like this. The surrounding circumstances eventually become bigger than the person. But Sally was somebody long before any of these words became attached to her name. Sally was 18 years old, and according to her mother, Sally loved elderly people. She loved animals, especially dogs. She was working that summer and had plans, real plans. Sally had signed up for the United States Navy, and eventually Sally wanted to become a registered nurse, just like her mother. Years later, Sally's mom described her daughter using two very simple words. She simply said Sally was light and joy. And I think you would agree that's worth remembering, because eventually we are going to talk about some pretty dark allegations surrounding Sally's social circle. But those allegations aren't Sally. There's something that became part of her story, and there's a difference. And then there's Shane Paul Stewart, a teenager who apparently loved that Camaro, and I mean really loved it. It wasn't just transportation. Later accounts described it as his prized car, copper-colored, 1980 Chevrolet Camaro. And when you think about a 16-year-old boy in Texas in 1988, being proud of his Camaro, well, that isn't exactly difficult to imagine. Shane and Sally had met through mutual friends in the fall of 1987. They started dating. And by the accounts available to us, their relationship wasn't always smooth. They broke up, and at some point they went their separate ways. But on July 4th, 1988, they were together again. And that's important, because this wasn't necessarily just an ordinary date in a long, uninterrupted relationship. They had recently found their way back to one another. And on Independence Day, they decided to go watch the fireworks. Now, there's a detail here that I like, because it makes this night feel incredibly normal. When Shane left home, he reportedly had $11. That's it, just $11. He hugs his dad and gets into that Camaro and heads out. Sally, meanwhile, tells her parents she's going to a friend's house. Nobody at either home apparently had any reason to believe that this would be the last time they were going to see Sally or Shane. Sally's stepfather would say years later it had simply been a good day. Nothing seemed wrong. Nothing suggested something terrible was about to happen. And that's one of those details that I think almost every parent understands. Because most last times, well, they don't announce themselves. Nobody says, pay attention, you're going to want to remember this. It's just someone walking out the door. And then later, you remember everything. The clothes, the conversation, whether they hugged you, or how much money they had in their pocket. Sally and Shane head toward Lake Nasworthy. There's a fireworks display that night. People are everywhere. Cars, families, boats, teenagers. And sometime that evening, Sally and Shane are there among them. Now here's where I want us to slow down, because once you start researching this case, you'll find extremely specific versions of what happened next. You'll find exact conversations, exact sightings, descriptions of who supposedly approached the Camaro, claims about arguments, claims about people following Sally and Shane. And some of those details may turn out to matter, and we're going to get to them, I promise. But we're not going to treat every story that's been repeated for 38 years as though it's automatically a documented fact, because that's exactly how cases like this become legends. And Shane and Sally don't need another legend. They need justice. So let's start with what we can establish. They went to Lake Nasworthy to watch fireworks. Later that night, around midnight, a Army Corps of Engineers lake ranger reported seeing a copper-colored 1980 Camaro inside Isabel Hart Park at the O.C. Fisher Reservoir. A white male and a white female were inside the car. Nothing appears to be wrong. Now, was that definitely Shane and Sally? The car matched Shane's Camaro. The occupants fit their general descriptions. But I want to phrase this carefully. The ranger saw the vehicle and two occupants. That's what we can say. Now, stop right there, because before we can talk about cults, before we can talk about stolen guns, before we can talk about Satanism, this is the mystery I think we're struggling to understand. Sally and Shane go to Lake Nasworthy. Around midnight, a car matching Shane's Camaro is seen at the O.C. Fisher Reservoir. By morning, that Camaro has apparently been moved again. And then it's sitting there without Sally or Shane. So what happened? What happened between the fireworks and sunrise? Investigators recover evidence around the Camaro. Some of it will become important years later. In fact, in 1994, DNA will reportedly be recovered from evidence associated with the area near Shane's car. The DNA will eventually be entered into CODIS, and at least as of a later public reporting, it hasn't produced the answers investigators are looking for. But before I get ahead of myself, in July of 1988, nobody knows any of that yet. All anyone knows is that two teenagers went out together on the 4th of July, and they didn't come home. The car's been found, but that young couple, they haven't. And just a few days later, on July 17th, Sally McNelly and Shane Stewart were officially entered as missing persons. And that's where the search really begins. But as people start trying to figure out where Sally and Shane could have gone, another story begins circulating. A story about people Sally and Shane had been spending time with, people allegedly interested in the occult. And ordinarily, I would be tempted to dismiss that as exactly the kind of rumor you'd expect to hear in 1988, except for one problem. Months before Sally and Shane disappeared, they apparently had gone to law enforcement themselves, and they brought something with them. A gun. A gun. And this is where Sally and Shane's story starts getting complicated, because up until now, we basically have been dealing with a missing person case. It became a double homicide. Two teenagers go to watch fireworks. Their car turns up about 8 miles away at another reservoir. And 4 months later, their remains are found near a third body of water. That's already a mystery. But several months before Shane and Sally disappeared, Sally apparently picked up the phone and called law enforcement herself. And the person she eventually spoke with was a Tom Green County Sheriff's deputy named Larry Counts. Sally told the deputy that she and Shane had become involved with a group of people, and they were trying to get away from them. She described drugs, sex, secrecy, and according to Sally, people involved in occult activity. Now, this is where you'll sometimes hear a very specific word attached to the story: cult. More specifically, a satanic cult. And we're going to talk about that a lot. But I'm not ready to call this group a satanic cult just because that's the label that eventually became attached to them. Not yet. Because right now, I'm much more interested, and I think you'll agree, much more interested in what Sally and Shane actually did. And what they did next was pretty unusual. They gave Deputy Counts a gun. According to Deputy Counts, Sally told him that another person associated with this group had given them the weapon, and whoever gave it to them supposedly made a very disturbing claim. They allegedly said the gun had been used in a murder and a robbery. That's a pretty serious statement. But notice how I'm wording it. Sally and Shane were told the gun had been used in a murder and a robbery. That doesn't necessarily mean it had been. And as far as I can establish, you see, law enforcement, well, they never proved that the gun had been. And that's important. But police did check the gun. And that's where this gets even more interesting. Because the gun, the weapon itself, it was stolen. Now let's stop for a second. Because if you or I, if we're Deputy Counts, well, that changes the conversation. Two teenagers come to you with a story that probably sounds pretty wild. They're talking about a secretive group, drugs, occult activity, and they're afraid. They supposedly have been handed a gun connected to some terrible crime. And initially, you might wonder whether you're listening to a teenage rumor that's really exaggerated or simply something misunderstood. And then you run the gun and it comes back stolen. That doesn't prove the cult story. It doesn't prove the weapon was used in a murder. Now, it doesn't prove Sally and Shane were marked for death, but it does tell you something. They didn't walk into that meeting empty-handed. There was a real gun, and there was something wrong with it. Sally and Shane's story became more credible to Deputy Counts, and during that meeting, they apparently told the deputy something else. They were afraid. They believed they might be in danger. Now, this is the part where hindsight becomes dangerous. Because after all, we know what eventually happened to Shane and Sally. We know they disappeared on July 4th. We know they were murdered. So when we hear that they told a sheriff's deputy months earlier, we're afraid someone might hurt us. It's almost impossible not to connect those two things. But we have to resist doing that automatically, because Sally and Shane being afraid of somebody doesn't prove that person eventually killed them. And it certainly doesn't prove they were murdered as part of an occult ritual. Those are conclusions, and we're just not there yet. But that fear matters, because unlike some of the stories that grew around this case later, This wasn't something somebody remembered for the first time after Sally and Shane were gone. They had gone to law enforcement themselves, and that's different. And according to the account that eventually became widely known, Sally and Shane weren't merely saying these people are strange. They were saying they wanted out. They believed the group was secretive, and they were worried that knowing too much might put them in danger. That's the story that would eventually become one of the central themes or theories in this case. Sally and Shane knew something. They tried to leave, and a person or persons made sure they couldn't talk. That's a compelling theory, maybe a little too compelling, because once you hear it, everything else starts fitting itself around it. The gun, the fear, the occult activity, the murders themselves, and suddenly you have a very strong and compelling story. But real murder investigations are rarely that neat. So I wanted to know, what do we actually have? We have Deputy Larry Count saying Sally contacted him. We have the deputy's account that Sally and Shane met with him. We have the gun. We have his statement that the gun was checked and found to have been stolen. We have Count saying Sally and Shane expressed concern that they could be hurt. Those are significant facts. Then we have another layer. And that layer would be what Sally and Shane reportedly believed about the people they were hanging out with. And then yet another layer beyond that. And that would be what other people later would believe about Sally and Shane. And those three things are not necessarily the same. And that's where I think this case got so tangled. Because Sally apparently had been spending time with people interested in occult practices. One of her friends would later describe attending one of those gatherings with Sally. There were candles, ritual-like behavior, and according to that friend, Sally appeared at one point to go into some weird, strange kind of trance. And her friend was disturbed enough by what she saw that she left. Even Shane's dad also noticed changes in his son during this period. Shane was getting into fights. There was at least one incident where the fight escalated and other people had to become involved. And Shane ended up being thrown into a river. So, again, there are things here. And we're not dealing with a story that appears completely out of nowhere after the murders. There were people around Sally and Shane who believed something troubling was happening. Sally and Shane themselves had apparently gone to police, and they had handed over a stolen weapon. But here's where I just keep putting on the brakes, because this is 1988, and that matters a lot. If you, like myself, lived through the 1980s, you probably remember some version of what became known as the Satanic Panic. Stories about secret satanic groups were everywhere. They were on television, in the newspapers, they were on talk shows. We talked about them in church. The police even held seminars. Rumors spread throughout communities about ritual killings. There were talks of animal sacrifices, secret ceremonies, secret organizations or societies. And these societies were enormous underground networks supposedly operating right up under everyone's noses. Some crimes genuinely involved people using occult imagery. Some teenagers absolutely experimented with satanic symbols and rituals. Some people committed very real crimes while claiming very bizarre beliefs. Those things happened, and they're still happening. But alongside those real events, there were also accusations that grew far beyond the available evidence. And that's the environment in which Sally and Shane's murders were being investigated. Which means we have to ask a difficult question. When people around Sally and Shane talked about a satanic cult, were they accurately describing a dangerous organized group? Were they describing teenagers experimenting with occult imagery, drugs, parties, scaring each other? Or was it something somewhere in between? Or did the word satanic eventually become so powerful that it overshadowed other explanations for why Sally and Shane were killed? I don't know. And I don't think anybody has publicly established the answer. But there's one thing here I don't want us to lose sight of. Let's just for a second or two strip away the word satanic out of this story completely. Let's just forget it just for a minute, very briefly. What are we left with? Two teenagers tell a sheriff's deputy that they're frightened of people they've been associated with. They turn over a gun. Police discover that gun is stolen. And a few months later, those very same two teenagers disappear, and eventually both are found murdered. You don't need Satanism to make this a crime. It's already a crime. And after Sally and Shane disappeared, their families started learning more about the people they'd been spending time with. More stories started to surface, more rumors, more allegations, and eventually the idea that Sally and Shane had been murdered because they tried to leave a satanic cult. Well, that became almost inseparable from the case itself. Then in September of 1991, millions of Americans were introduced to Sally and Shane's story. I was one of them. And if you remember that Unsolved Mysteries episode, there's a good chance you remember the same things I do. The candles, the rituals, the alleged cult, that stolen gun, and the possibility that Shane and Sally had been killed because they knew too much. It made for unforgettable television. But more than 3 decades have passed since that episode aired. Investigators have gone back through this case. DNA evidence has been tested. Suspects have been examined. The FBI became involved. Searches were conducted again, and reporters have gone back and spoken to the people who were actually there. So now, with everything we know today, I think it's time to go back to that story we were told in 1991 and ask a question nobody watching television that night could possibly have answered. How much of that story still holds up? That's the question I keep coming back to. Because if you're around my age, there's a pretty good chance the first time you heard about Sally and Shane, well, that was the same place I did. Unsolved Mysteries. Their story aired in September of 1991, and for one, I remember it. Now, I'm not going to sit here 35 years later and criticize a television show for not knowing things that nobody knew yet. That's just not fair. And frankly, Unsolved Mysteries did something incredibly important. like they have for many other cases. Unsolved Mysteries put Sally and Shane's faces, their names, and their unsolved murders in front of millions of people. But it also captured this case at a very particular moment in American history. And that's important because in 1991, you couldn't really tell a story involving teenagers, occult rituals, and a mysterious gun, and possibly Satanism without bringing a whole lot of cultural baggage along with it. By then, America had spent years hearing about stories concerning satanic cults. And I don't mean occasionally, these stories were everywhere. They were on daytime television, they were on nighttime television, they were in books, churches, newspapers, even police training. Parents were being warned about supposedly hidden satanic symbols. People were talking about secret rituals, animal sacrifices, underground networks, and murders supposedly committed as part of elaborate ceremonies. Now, here's where this stuff gets difficult, because saying there was a satanic panic does not mean every person who talked about occult activity was necessarily being untruthful. That's too easy. People really did experiment with occult practices. Some people genuinely believe in Satanism. Teenagers played with rituals. Some groups used occult imagery, and obviously, people involved in those circles were capable of committing crimes just like anybody else, back then and today. The problem comes when we make a leap from these people were interested in the occult to therefore this murder was an occult ritual. Those are two completely different statements. And I'm not convinced that the evidence in Sally and Shane's case ever got us from one to the other. So let's go back to what we actually have. Sally and Shane apparently associated with people interested in occult practices. And that's supported by multiple accounts. They were gatherings, they were candles, and they were rituals, or at least behavior that the people present interpreted as a ritual. And there were drugs, and there were troubled relationships. And Sally and Shane apparently became uncomfortable enough with some of the people around them that they contacted law enforcement. And then there's that gun, a real gun, given to Deputy Larry Counts, and police reportedly determined that it had actually been stolen. Those things matter, so let's not dismiss any of them. But now let's look at what we don't have. We don't have proof that the gun was used in a murder. We don't have proof that Sally and Shane actually witnessed a ritual killing. We don't have proof that some organized satanic group sentenced them to death. And we don't have proof that their murders themselves were part of a ritual. And that's where this story begins to look a little different. Think about the actual crime scene. Sally and Shane weren't discovered inside some ritualistic chamber. There wasn't an altar. There weren't pentagrams carved around them, and there wasn't some documented collection of occultic objects surrounding their remains. They were found months after they disappeared in a pasture near Twin Buttes Reservoir, and they had been shot. That's a double homicide, a terrible one. But nothing about that fact alone tells us why. And motive is where this case gets messy. Now, one of the things I found very interesting while going back through this case, and I believe you'll find it interesting as well, is what happened when people involved with that old social circle were interviewed again years later. Because memories change and perspectives change. And sometimes people who were teenagers when something happened, well, they tend to describe things very differently as an adult looking backward. Some of the people later interviewed about this supposed occult group, they didn't describe some sophisticated underground satanic organization. They described a bunch of teenagers, young people experimenting, trying things, playing with occult ideas, and doing drugs, scaring themselves, and probably scaring each other. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't someone dangerous among them. That's important. A group doesn't have to be an organized satanic cult for one person in that group to be capable of murder. And I think that's where the terminology may have gotten in the way. Because once everyone starts asking which satanic cult killed Sally and Shane, well, then you may stop asking the simpler question: who had a reason to kill Sally and Shane? Maybe those questions lead to the same person, and maybe they don't. We still don't know. But there's something else investigators had to consider. What if Sally and Shane weren't killed because of some secret occult knowledge at all? What if the motive was personal? Maybe jealousy, anger, retaliation, drugs, maybe a relationship, maybe something they witnessed, something involving that gun, or something investigators still haven't made public to this day. Once you remove the word satanic, the number of possibilities actually gets larger, and that can get uncomfortable because the cult theory gives the story a shape. It gives us villains, and it gives us motive. It gives us an explanation for the fear, and even gives us a reason Sally and Shane supposedly would have to die. It's almost too complete. And whenever a theory explains absolutely nothing, I'd start wanting to know what doesn't fit. Here's one thing that doesn't fit neatly: the movement that night. Remember our three lakes: Lake Nasworthy, O.C. Fisher Reservoir, and Twin Buttes Reservoir. Sally and Shane go to Lake Nasworthy for fireworks around midnight. A ranger sees what appears to be Shane's Camaro at O.C. Fisher. A man and woman are reportedly inside, and the next morning the Camaro is found elsewhere within Isabel Hart Park. And Shane and Sally aren't there. Months later, their remains are found in a pasture near Twin Buttes. I think if we want to understand this murder, we have to understand that movement. Who drove Shane's Camaro from Lake Nasworthy to O.C. Fisher? Was it Shane? Probably. But can we prove that? Who was inside the Camaro when the ranger saw it? Were those two people definitely Sally and Shane? Again, likely, perhaps, but we need to distinguish likely from proven. And if Sally and Shane were alive at O.C. Fisher around midnight, what happened next? Did they leave with somebody? Did they meet someone there? Did another vehicle become involved? Did something happen at O.C. Fisher? Or had whatever eventually led to their murders, had it already begun? And those questions have nothing to do with Satanism. They're timeline questions. And timeline questions are usually where murder cases get solved. Then there's something else: the car itself. Evidence was recovered from around the area where Shane's Camaro was found. and years later, DNA was reportedly developed from evidence associated with that scene. In 1994, the DNA profile was entered into CODIS. No match, at least not publicly. But think about what that means. Somewhere inside the evidence from this case, there may be a biological profile belonging to someone investigators wanted to identify. And DNA doesn't care about rumors. It doesn't care what was on television in 1991. It doesn't care whether someone called themselves a Satanist or whether someone else called them one. DNA asks a much simpler question. Who were you? And that's where Sally and Shane's story begins moving away from the version many of us remember. Because the television episode ends, the 1990s continue, then the 2000s. Years pass. Parents get older, witnesses get older, memories begin to fade. Some people pass on, but the case itself, it doesn't disappear. Investigators keep coming back to it, and Sally's family keeps pushing. Shane's family, they keep wanting answers as well. But then in 2016, something important happens. The FBI becomes involved. Not because somebody has suddenly proven a satanic cult killed Shane and Sally. The FBI comes in to assist with the homicide investigation, behavioral analysis, investigative assistance. Another set of new eyes on an old case. And by this point, investigators have something their counterparts in 1988 didn't. Nearly 3 decades of advances in forensic science. This case isn't over. Not by a long shot. And then the following year, 2017, something happens that makes it look like investigators may finally have gotten the break everyone had been waiting for. And strangely enough, it didn't begin with Sally. It didn't begin with Shane. And it doesn't begin with a lake. And it doesn't even begin with the occult. It begins with a totally unrelated investigation. Law enforcement encounters a man named John Cyrus Gilbreth. And eventually investigators search his property. What they reportedly find there gets people's attention very quickly. Writings, audio recordings, biological material, hair, and what was described in a reporting as a fingernail. And references that investigators believe could have some connection to Sally and Shane. After nearly 30 years, you can imagine how that looked. This wasn't a rumor from 1988. This wasn't something remembered on a television program. Investigators were physically removing potential evidence from the property of a man they considered a person of interest. And if you're thinking, okay, this is it, they finally got him, I understand. Because that's exactly where this appears to be going, right? Except it isn't. Because years later, we would learn something about that biological evidence. Something people following the headlines in 2017, well, they didn't know. The DNA was tested, but it didn't belong to Sally or Shane. So now what? Because now think about where we are. Almost 30 years after Sally and Shane were murdered, investigators searched the property of a man that they consider a person of interest. They recover biological material, hair, and what was described as a fingernail, some writings, audio recordings, and things that appear, at least initially, like they could finally move this case somewhere. And then the testing comes back. The biological evidence, it doesn't belong to Sally, and it doesn't belong to Shane. So you might think that's the end of John Gilbreth's connection to this investigation. But it isn't. And this is an important distinction. That DNA result did not prove Gilbreth had nothing to do with Sally and Shane's murders. It proved something much narrower. The biological material recovered from his property, it didn't belong to Sally or Shane. And according to Tom Green County Sheriff Nick Hanna, investigators still had reason to be suspicious of Gilbreth. One of those reasons involved his behavior over the years. It seems Gilbreth had reportedly made claims that he knew details about Sally and Shane's murders. So the DNA test, well, that lead may have fizzled, but Gilbreth himself simply didn't disappear from the investigation. And I want to emphasize this again. John Cyrus Gilbreth has never been charged with the killing of Sally or Shane. Being someone investigators remain suspicious of, well, that's not the same thing as being proved guilty. And Gilbreth wasn't the only person investigators examined. But nearly 40 years later, nobody has been charged with these murders. But the Gilbreth search is still worth understanding, because law enforcement didn't originally go to his home looking for evidence concerning Shane and Sally. Gilbreth came onto their radar during an unrelated investigation in June of 2017. Following a traffic stop and search, investigators eventually entered his residence. And inside, they found something they were not expecting. Writings concerning Sally and Shane, audio recordings, biological material, and that biological material being hair. But blood was described in some contemporary reporting. And then again, there's the fingernail material. Some of the writings were described in court documents as being specific to the offense of murder and containing Sally and Shane's names. 3 audio cassette tapes reportedly had the initials SS written on them, and suddenly, a search that had began with an unrelated criminal investigation had crossed directly into one of San Angelo's most notorious unsolved murders. You can understand why investigators were interested. You can also understand why people following the case in 2017, they thought this might be it. But years later, the DNA testing told us something different the headlines in 2017 couldn't. That biological material didn't belong to Sally or Shane. Fair enough. But I think we need to be careful not to make the opposite mistake now. In 2017, it would have been wrong to say they, the investigators, found Sally and Shane's DNA at Gilbreth's house, because they haven't established that. Today, it would be equally wrong to say the DNA didn't match, so Gilbreth was cleared, because that's not what happened either. The evidence simply didn't give investigators the forensic connection that they might have hoped for. And according to Sheriff Hanna, other aspects of Gilbreth's behavior continue to raise suspicion. That's where Gilbreth stands in this story. Not convicted, not charged, but not someone investigators simply forgot about either. And after learning that, I started thinking about something from much earlier in this story. Something we haven't talked about in a while. The gun. You remember that gun. Months before Sally and Shane disappeared, they went to Deputy Larry Counts. They handed him a firearm. And according to the deputy, they'd been told it had been used in a murder and a robbery. Police checked it, and what they could establish was that that gun had been reported stolen. Now imagine having that gun today. Let's forget the occult story for a minute. Let's forget the alleged cult. You've got an unsolved double homicide. And before the two victims were murdered, they personally handed law enforcement a stolen firearm while telling a deputy that they were afraid of people they had been associating with. You would want that gun, wouldn't you? I know I would. And I would want to know everything that could possibly be learned about that gun. For example, where did it originally come from? Who owned it? When was it stolen? Who possessed it afterward? How did Shane and Sally actually get that gun? Whether anything in its history intersects with anyone in this investigation. So, where is it? And that's where things get frustrating, because decades later, when people went back trying to reconstruct this case, the gun apparently, well, it could no longer be accounted for. And I need to be careful with that statement. I'm not telling you somebody intentionally made evidence disappear. I or no one else has evidence of that. This investigation began in 1988. Records change, people retire, evidence gets transferred. Retention policies change, items can be returned or misfiled or accidentally disposed of, or simply become extraordinarily difficult to trace decades later. So I'm not saying somebody hit the gun. I'm just saying something much simpler. We can't tell you today where that gun actually is. And considering what that gun represented, that's frustrating. Because the importance of that gun isn't necessarily that it was a murder weapon. We don't know that it was. There's no proof I've found that it was used to kill anyone. The importance is that gun was one of the few tangible things that Sally and Shane brought to law enforcement before they lost their lives. They weren't merely telling a story. They handed over an actual stolen firearm. And decades later, when forensic technology is better than anything investigators in 1988 could have imagined, the very thing you'd like to go back and examine apparently isn't available to examine. And strangely enough, that gun isn't the only piece of evidence in this story that's raising questions. There's another item, and this one is honestly one of the strangest details I've encountered in this entire case. Sally's driver's license. After Sally disappeared, her driver's license was missing. Nothing particularly remarkable about that by itself. She could have had it with her. It could have been lost. There are any number of possibilities. But years later, according to the investigation conducted by Texas Monthly reporters Karen Jacobs and Rob D'Amico, Sally's missing driver's license turned up. And where it reportedly turned up is the part that makes you stop. It was found on the floor inside the San Angelo Police Department. Yeah, that's one of those details where I had to go back and make sure I'd understood that correctly. Sally's missing driver's license reportedly found on the floor of the police department. Now, what does that mean? Well, for one, I don't know. And I'm not going to pretend I do. Maybe there's an innocent explanation. Maybe it had been collected at some point and became separated from the other material, the other evidence. Maybe somebody brought it in. Maybe there's paperwork somewhere explaining exactly how it got there. Or maybe its very presence there raises a question nobody has satisfactorily answered. But here's what we cannot responsibly do. We cannot jump from Sally's driver's license was reportedly found inside a police department to therefore police were involved in the murders. That's an enormous accusation, and we don't have evidence to make that accusation. But we can ask, how did Sally's driver's license get there? And that's a fair question. And it's apparently not the only reason questions about law enforcement eventually become part of this case. In 2024, Texas Monthly released an extensive investigation into Sally and Shane's murders. Reporters went back through the case. They interviewed investigators, friends, and witnesses. They interviewed people connected to Sally and Shane. And they also interviewed people who have been attacked around those lakes and people whose names had surfaced as investigative suspects over the years. And something interesting happens when you look at this case from that distance. The satanic cult theory, well, that starts occupying less of the overall picture. Not quite disappearing, but getting smaller. And other things start getting bigger, especially the lakes. Remember how we started this episode? 3 bodies of water: Lake Nasworthy, O.C. Fisher, and Twin Buttes. Well, Sally and Shane, as it turns out, were not the only people who experienced violence around the lakes that surround San Angelo. The Texas Monthly investigation examined other unsolved attacks, including people who survived violent encounters around those lake areas. And naturally, that raises a question. Could any of those attacks be connected to what happened to Sally and Shane? Maybe, but again, that's a theory. There's been no public determination that one person or one group committed all those crimes. And unfortunately, similarity, well, that's not proof. People gather around lakes. Teenagers go there, couples go there, people drink there, people party there. And unfortunately, people go to lakes to commit crimes. So crime does happen around lakes as well. So several crimes occurring around lakes in the same general region doesn't automatically make them connected. But when you're investigating an unsolved double homicide, you certainly would want to know, were there similarities? Did any names overlap? Did the same vehicles appear over and over? Did victims describe maybe the same person? Was there a pattern? Those are legitimate investigative questions. And according to the newer reporting, some investigators, well, they've asked those questions. Then we get to probably the most sensitive part of this entire story. Because during the modern investigation, a possibility emerged that had nothing to do with satanic rituals, nothing to do with cults, and there was nothing supernatural about it. There's the possibility that someone associated with law enforcement may know more about Sally and Shane's murders than they have revealed. Now let's stop right there. That's not a proven fact. It's not a finding that law enforcement killed Sally and Shane. It's not evidence that the sheriff's office or police department covered up those murders. It's just not. And I'm not going to name somebody and accuse them of a homicide based on a theory. But what we can say is that investigators and reporters, well, they've examined that possibility. And once you know that, certain things we've already talked about become harder to ignore. The gun that apparently can now not be located, Sally's driver's license reportedly turning up inside a police department on the floor. Questions about evidence and questions about what certain people may have knew. And of course, like we talked about earlier, none of these things prove corruption, but together they give investigators another avenue to examine, and that avenue looks very different from the story America saw on television in 1991. And this is where I realized something while researching Sally and Shane. We started this episode asking, was the occult connection real? And I think we can answer part of that now. Yes. There appears to have been a real occult experimentation going on among people Sally and Shane knew. There were gatherings. There were rituals. Or at least behavior people described as a ritual. Sally and Shane apparently became frightened enough by people around them that they contacted law enforcement and they handed over a stolen gun. So the occult element wasn't simply invented by television producers. There was something there. But here's the part we can't answer. Did any of that have anything to do with their murders? Nearly 40 years later, we still don't know. And so when you look at everything investigators have uncovered since 1991, the case becomes much larger than the cult theory. Think about what we're actually left with. Two teenagers go out together on July 4th. They watch fireworks. Their car moves from Lake Nasworthy to O.C. Fisher. And around midnight, a ranger apparently sees a man and a woman sitting inside that Camaro. By morning, the Camaro has moved again. Sally and Shane are gone. 4 months later, their remains are found near Twin Buttes. Both have been shot. And before their deaths, they had told a deputy they were afraid, and they handed him a stolen gun. Years later, DNA is developed from evidence associated with the area around Shane's abandoned Camaro. Now, it doesn't publicly identify the killer or killers. The FBI eventually joined in the investigation, and a person of interest emerged in 2017. The biological evidence, well, it looked promising, but in the end, it didn't match Shane or Sally. But that person of interest is not simply eliminated from the investigator's thinking. And other aspects of his behavior continue to raise questions. Old evidence becomes difficult or impossible to account for, and investigators began considering possibilities that have nothing to do with Satanism. That's the case. Not the television version, not the rumor, not the legend. That's what we're actually looking at. And after spending all this time with it, there's one part I just can't get past. It's not the rituals, it's not the alleged cult, it's not even the gun. It's the time, those few hours between the fireworks on July 4th and Shane's Camaro sitting empty the next morning. Because somebody knows what happened during those hours. Somebody knows why that Camaro left Lake Nasworthy. Somebody knows who was inside that car at the O.C. Fisher Reservoir. Somebody knows whether Sally and Shane left the park willingly. Somebody knows how they eventually reached the area near Twin Buttes, that pasture. And somewhere inside those handful of hours, where there's the answer to a mystery that has survived every theory we've talked about today. Satanism, drugs, retaliation, jealousy, the stolen gun, John Cyrus Gilbreth, other investigative suspects, other attacks, possible law enforcement knowledge. One of those things may matter enormously. Several may actually matter. Or we may still be looking in the complete wrong direction. But somebody knows something, because Sally and Shane didn't simply vanish between three lakes. Someone did this to them. And almost 40 years later, nobody has been charged with their murders. Maybe the occult had something to do with Sally and Shane. Maybe that's why they were murdered. Maybe it didn't. But after all this time, they deserve an answer based on evidence, not a legend. I'm your host, Tim Eubanks. Thank you for listening to the Bucklesberry Lemonade podcast. And until next time, please remember to lock your doors, turn on your porch lights, hug a loved one, and stay safe out there.